Right. Okay, folks, just to check one more time, if everyone can mute the microphones and, if possible, turn off your cameras so we can all focus on Claire and the presentation. Right, so it's 7:05, and I'm Steve Harding, and with Sue, whose camera's not working, but Sue Bishop, we've both been running this Facebook group called Wirral Viking Trail, which we started about 18 months ago, and it started off with 10, 15, 20 people, which we were delighted. We thought that's great, people are supporting this, and it seemed to have shot up to 1,400 members now, which is incredible. So with this number, I think Sue had the idea that Sue and I are both from the Wirral, by the way. We're exiles. I live in Nottingham now, and Sue lives near Cambridge. But we had this idea that maybe we could, because there's so many people, we could organise like an online seminar series, and giving people, many who don't normally have the chance to listen to things like this, to join. So we've done this, and then we were thinking of who would be great to give the first talk, and we both agreed Claire, and we asked Claire, and Claire very kindly said yes. So a big thanks to Claire for giving the inaugural lecture seminar in this Wirral Viking Trail series. The idea was to have a talk once every month or 2 months, and if anyone's got any ideas for speakers, or indeed would like to give a presentation yourselves, then we can absolutely facilitate this. So anyway, Claire is our first speaker, and Claire and I go back a long time. In fact, I first met Claire on Valentine's Day, believe it or not, in you remember 2008, I think it was, when she was invited to give one of our Norse and Viking seminars here at Nottingham, and afterwards, by tradition, we pile into some nice restaurant. I think it was somewhere near Beeston, wasn't it? Because it was Valentine's Day, everywhere was booked up. We ended up somewhere near Sainsbury's. So that's when I first met Claire, and then Claire was at Aberdeen University, and then 2 years later she ended up at Liverpool. But anyway, a bit of biography about Claire. She wasn't always at Aberdeen, so she started off life brought up in near Crewe, Leighton, near Crewe, and she did a degree at St Andrews University, and then did a PhD at the University of Cambridge, then on to do a postdoc, I think, Claire, at Dublin, and then got a lectureship in Celtic Studies at the University of Aberdeen, and then moved to Liverpool in 2010 as associate professor, and for the last 3 years as full professor. But Claire is also, I mean, I could go through take me hours to go through all this, but Claire is also, she's chairman, is it chairman or president? I don't know what right name, of the Northern Society for Viking Research. Is that right? Or the Viking Society for Northern Research?
Scottish Society for Northern Studies, yeah.
Right. Okay, and actually Claire tells me that they have their own seminar series every few weeks.
Yeah, well, we've been doing an online lecture on a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, and it's either been once a month or once every 2 months, and we sometimes have in-person events as well, but they're free for anybody to join. You don't have to be a member of the society to listen in on our online lectures. So if anybody wants to look up, it's Scottish Society of Northern Studies. We've got an events page, and you can register for any of our talks off that website.
We will. So what we'll do, what Sue and I will do, we'll put a note up on the Wirral Viking Trail Facebook site, and then we'll remind people when the talks come up. And again, like this, there's no limit on numbers. Anybody can join.
Yeah, more the merrier. Yeah.
And while I'm here, before I forget, if anyone wants to join the Wirral Viking Trail group, I can give you a link on the chat at the end. Yeah. So yeah, join Clare's talk. Please keep microphones off and cameras off if you can. And if you, Clare, you'll be taking questions at the end, I hope.
Yeah.
So at the end, probably the best way of doing this is if you put your question on the chat box facility. There should have an icon with chat at the top of the Teams page, and then Sue and I can read these questions out, and then Clare can answer them. And it'll be recorded as well, so those people who missed the talk will be able to catch up. Okay, so without much ado, then I'll introduce Clare's talk, which is the early Vikings of Dublin and why some of them moved to the Wirral. Clare, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Great, thank you so much, Steve. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so it's nice to give this lecture. I've given some talks before that some of you may have heard about Vikings in the Northwest or the Battle of Brunanburh, and I thought I would try not and just repeat something I've done before, but I would kind of give a bit of the background of the Vikings that came to the Wirral and why the area would have been attracted to them and why the settlement on Wirral was important. So it's a story of the sort of origins of the Vikings in the area. So to do that, I want to go back to the narrative of the first Viking raids in Britain and Ireland. Now, most of you will have heard already of a Viking attack which took place on Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England in the year 793. It's a really famous event which is often seen to mark the beginning of the Viking Age. We've got some really vivid accounts of the event, both in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle when the Viking raid was preceded by heavenly portents, but also in the writings of Alcuin, a Northumbrian cleric on the continent, who wrote letters after the event expressing his shock about the blood of God's priests being splattered across the altar at Lindisfarne. Now, the beginning of raids in Ireland occurs about the same time. Now, we do have some earlier charter evidence as well as letters written that actually suggest that when Vikings first arrived in the 790s, the first recorded attacks happened. They weren't completely unfamiliar or unknown. There'd clearly been comings and goings across the seaways for a while, but definitely the 790s marks a departure and increased military activity of Vikings around the seaways of Britain and Ireland that may be associated with developing trade links as well to Scandinavia. Now, in the year 794, the islands of Britain and Ireland were under attack, according to Irish chroniclers. And in 795, we get our first recorded attacks on Ireland. And there were three that took place in the year 795. One on Inishmurray, another on Inishbofin, both islands off Ireland's west coast, and another attack on a site called Recrew, which could be associated either as Lambay Island in Dublin Bay or Rathlin Island, which is off the coast of Antrim. So this is quite a wide range of attacks. There's quite a lot of miles between these sites, and they're all ecclesiastical sites located on Ireland, so very much replicating the pattern of Lindisfarne, that these were sites that were wealthy and significant, but they were quite vulnerable to attack and open to, particularly attacks from the sea. And that's really how we developed quite a lot of our stereotypes of early Viking activities and these first named events, these attacks on these islands. But we can also see evidence of more sustained interaction between Vikings and people in Ireland a few years later. In 798, Vikings attacked Holmpatrick, which is in Dublin Bay. And what's particularly interesting about this attack is they didn't just raid a church and carry off some loot, but they also gathered the cattle tribute of the neighbouring territories. And that kind of invites the suggestion that maybe the early raids and early Viking settlement weren't too separate. We tend to think there was a phase of raiding, and then, you know, a few decades later, Vikings came and settled down. But if they're already gathering cattle tribute from neighbouring territories, they had to stay around for a while. You know, the cattle has to be gathered, it has to be counted, presumably it has to be slaughtered. You know, are they going to consume it? Are they going to prepare the meat to then carry off on their ships for their next journey? So we may even have temporary settlements of Vikings as early back as the 790s. And there's some archaeological validation for that as well. Lindsay Simpson, archaeologist in Dublin, was responsible for excavating 4 burials in South George's Street in the area of Dublin. And the radiocarbon dates of these young males who were accompanied by weapons, shields, daggers, personal ornaments that suggest they were what we would call Vikings. The radiocarbon date suggested dates in the late 8th century, which is about half a century before we conventionally date Viking settlement in Ireland. So it's really interesting how new research starts to muddle some of our preconceptions about the nature of early Viking settlement. So there's quite a lot of activity around the Irish coast from the 790s onwards. And we can also see that further north along the seaways around Scotland as well. So this is a picture of Iona. This was a very important early monastic site dedicated to St. Columba, one of Ireland's most famous saints. And it's off the coast of Mull, so the Hebrides of Scotland. And this site witnessed a whole series of Viking attacks in 795, in 802, in 806, when 68 members of the community were slaughtered by Vikings, and again in 825, when one of the monks called Blathvak was martyred. And this raises other questions as well. Now, we know that Vikings would attach churches for portable loot, but how much would have been left at Iona by the time the 4th Viking attack happened in 825? And that maybe suggests that there is also a political dimension to some of these attacks that are taking place. Perhaps they're battling for control over strategic seaways. Perhaps they're looking to take land in the area of the Hebrides. So what we can see is an emerging strategy in Viking attacks from the first recorded activities in the 790s in the years that followed. Now, we can also follow the trail of some of that loot that was plundered from churches in Britain and Ireland, going back to, if you like, the Scandinavian homelands. So these are images of items which have been recovered from graves along the coast of Western Norway, suggesting that this is the area where some of the raiders went out from. And these are some of the treasures that they brought back home after their attacks. There are also links, not just with the west coast of Norway, but further south as well. So Kalpang is in the Vestfold area of modern Norway in the south of the country. And this was developing as a trading base in the early 9th century. It's a location where Arabic silver coins have been found, gold coins from the Low Countries, glass beads, weapons, tools, a whole panoply of goods traded from across the Viking world. And it's been suggested that some of the early raids in Ireland were also linked with this trading centre. Items of insular origin have also been recovered at Kalpang. And that suggests that one of the motivations for the Viking Age was the acquisition of luxury goods that could then be traded through a network of Viking ports and other settlements. And so, if you like, the attacks on Ireland could be seen as the extension of a Viking trading network. It could be theorized as a kind of militarized diaspora for the purpose of trade. Now, this map shows us raids around the coast of Ireland from 795 to 851. You can see that by 824, Vikings had circumnavigated Ireland. They attacked Skellig Michael, again, another religious site on islands off the west coast of Kerry, the southwest tip of Ireland. And eventually they would venture inland along the river systems. You've got the River Shannon that runs through the centre of Ireland, the River Liffey, which obviously runs from where Dublin is now, and further north, the River Boyne. So you can kind of see the Vikings kind of exploring their way, firstly around the coast, and then more adventurous military endeavours inland. So the Irish Chronicles are a very rich resource, and this is really the contrast. We have got so much evidence from Ireland. We've got a dozen or so chronicles recording events from the 9th century. We don't have anything equivalent from the northwest coast of England at this time. Which raises a question: is it because there was no Viking activity in the northwest of England, or do we just not have any written evidence to tell us? So the evidence from Ireland, I think, raises that question. There's probably more happening in the northwest than we tend to think about, simply because the sources are missing. So in the 820s and 830s in Ireland, we see a build-up of military activity. We've got evidence of slave taking and holding people to ransom. So we start to see the strategy where they capture high-status individuals and then sell them back to their family. We also see Vikings being employed as hitmen and starting to be involved in Irish politics. In 837, we get the first name of a Viking leader, which suggests that conversations are taking place between Vikings and Irish people. And in 841, we get large-scale expeditions into the interior of Ireland. So 60 ships enter the estuary of the River Boyne, and 60 ships enter the River Liffey. And this looks like an attempt at conquest or long-term settlement within Ireland. And that brings us to the early Viking settlement at Dublin. So whilst the record of Viking activity at Holm-Patrick suggests that Vikings were active in Dublin Bay from the end of the 8th century, we first hear of a permanent settlement being established in Dublin in the year 841 when Vikings overwintered. Now, what we've got a map of here is the area of the earliest Viking settlement in Dublin, so the River Liffey, which you'll all have heard of. And then you've got this pool here. So this is the River Liffey, this is the River Poddle, and this is the dark pool, the Linn Duv, or Duvlin, from which Dublin gets its name. And this is the area of the earliest Viking settlement. That's where the earliest archaeology has been recovered. And then we've got these early burials in this area around here as well, around this dark pool. And you can see that Dublin offered several advantages to Viking settlers. One, access to an inland waterway and access to the sea. It was on a naturally defended site between two rivers. So you've got natural defences on three sides of the early settlement. It also has access to a very rich hinterland. Some of the best farmland in Ireland is in the central East Midlands, so the area behind Dublin, which offered opportunities for trade. And it was also on the boundary between two major Irish provincial kingdoms, Leinster and the Southern Nail territories, which meant that they could either work as go-betweens in trade between these Irish groups, or that they could play off the rivalries between the different provinces. So whilst we tend to have a stereotype of Vikings as, sort of unthinkingly plundering and being kind of chaotically violent, when we actually look at their activities, we see an awful lot of strategy and thought behind their activities in these early years of settlement. And the locational advantages of Dublin meant that it flourished as a settlement. We have the emergence of a whole number of Viking silver hoards in Ireland from the mid-9th century, suggesting that this became a very effective trading base. And a lot of the early silver hoards in Ireland do cluster around Dublin, showing that integration in Viking trade routes brought this flow of wealth into Ireland as goods were imported and exported across the Irish Sea. Now, Dublin wasn't the only base that was founded by Vikings in Ireland. There's a whole slew of them recorded from the late 830s until the 860s. And this map here shows where they were located. So there's a strong emphasis on early Viking bases being at coastal locations with access to inland rivers and waterways. That's key. And that would also be significant when we consider Viking settlement on the Wirral as well. Interestingly, some of these bases would be in competition with each other. The Vikings weren't a single united group at this time. Rather, they were competing war bands trying to carve out their own spheres of influence in Ireland. And sometimes they would engage in alliance with Irish groups against rival Viking groups. So the politics becomes quite complex from an early stage. Now, one fascinating early period of Viking activity in Ireland is this period in the 840s. Now, as mentioned, this is when we get large fleets arriving in Ireland, and I would suggest that this period, just before the mid-9th century, is when Vikings were really trying to conquer large areas of Ireland. They tried and failed to take a significant landholding. And in Irish chronicles, as well as later sagas, this is associated with the activities of a Viking leader, in Latin Turgesius, probably Thorgils in Norse, who led a series of expeditions up the River Shannon, which is the main waterway that runs through the centre of Ireland. He attacked the churches of Armagh and Clonmacnoise, which were major church institutions in the 9th century. You can see an aerial image of Clonmacnoise on the River Shannon on the slide there. And Turgesius led these campaigns, and he also becomes a figure of legend. So he's recorded in the 17th century for the heavy burdens of taxation that he placed on the Irish. We hear in one Irish saga of the 12th century, the War of the Irish and the Foreigners, that his wife Ota was a prophetess, and she stood on the altar of the church at Clonmacnoise, issuing her heathen prophecies to the surrounding Vikings, this kind of subversion of a Christian altar being turned as a footrest for a pagan priestess, so very vivid. And we also get saga accounts of the downfall of Turgesh and his followers. According to a 12th century legend by Gerald of Wales, the Irish sent a delegation to negotiate with Thorgils, and they agreed that they would send them plenty of beautiful Irish young ladies to cement the alliance between the Vikings and the Irish. But actually the young ladies were beardless Irish warriors dressed up as women. And in the midst of their embraces, Gerald of Wales tells us, the young Irishmen whipped out their swords and slaughtered the Vikings. Now, that probably owes more to legend than reality, but we do know that Thorgils was captured by an Irish king, Melchechnel, and he was ritually drowned at Loch Owl in County Westmeath in the year 845. And this seems to have marked this major attempt of Vikings to conquer land in Ireland. Indeed, we hear of an Irish king travelling through Francia in the late 840s on pilgrimage to Rome to thank God for the victories that they had had over the Vikings. And after the 840s, what we see Vikings in Ireland then doing is focusing on these coastal ports that they established them and really developing them as trading bases. Now, at the end of the 840s, a new group of Vikings arrives in Ireland who tend to be called the Dovgal, the dark foreigners. And they are led by a trio of kings, Ivar, Olaf and Owsle, who in the 850s managed to establish their power as leaders of Vikings across Ireland. And they often led campaigns in the Midlands of Ireland, but also as far afield as Munster in the southwest of Ireland during the 850s. According to some accounts, these three leaders were brothers, and in others they are just simply referred to as allies and associates. But all three of these Vikings who campaigned in Ireland in the 850s would be active in Britain in the following decade. In the year 866, Owsle and Olaf went to Pictland, where they campaigned and they took hostages, an event that are recorded in Irish chronicles, but also in the chronicles of Kings of Alba. The other leader, Ivar, is associated with the Great Army that raided around England in the late 860s, and he's credited in a later narrative with the martyrdom of Edmund, King of East Anglia. And there has been some debate as to whether the Ivar in England is indeed the same as the Ivar in Ireland, but the chronology fits. He never seems to be in both countries at the same time. And also during the 860s, during the absence of this trio of Viking leaders from Ireland, we can start to see the Irish fighting back. In 866 and 867, several of the Viking bases that had been founded by Vikings in the 840s were overwhelmed and taken back by the Irish, suggesting that indeed their leaders may have been away, and this was an opportunity for the Irish to regain some territory. I think the thing that also helps consolidate the idea that Ivar of Ireland is the same as the Ivar campaigning in England is the events of the year 870, when Ivar and Olaf together besieged Dumbarton Rock. So Ivar is in Britain in the year 870. This 3-month siege takes place, and this is a royal centre that was based in the River Clyde, so near modern-day Glasgow. And the following year, Ivar and Olaf returned to Ireland with 200 ships full of booty that they've acquired in Britain, and lots of slaves. And the slaves are identified as being English, so suggesting slaves gathered during the expeditions of Ivar, as well as Britons and Picts. And 2 years later, in 873, Ivar dies, and he's called the king of all the Vikings of Britain and Ireland in the Irish Chronicles. Now, Ivar may be known to some of you through drama on TV and later legends where he's called Ivar the Boneless. So he's a figure with a long literary history that followed on the years after his death. Now, Ivar was the founder of a dynasty that would rule intermittently in Dublin, but also in Northumbria in England as well. And this is what will bring us closer to understanding the arrival of Vikings in the Wirral. And this is just a list of some of his sons and grandsons whose activities are recorded in Irish chronicles and in English chronicles as well. As is often the way after the death of a great leader, what we see in the 880s and the 90s is disputes arising between his sons. So it's, if you like, the inheritors of Ivar's greatness are squabbling over. You know, he'd left a power vacuum when he died, and none of his sons seems to have successfully quite filled the boots of Ivar. So there's a lot of fighting between them. And in 893, a contingent of Vikings leaves Dublin. So this fallout has led to different groups, you know, splitting off. And this group arrives at Chester. There was a Viking group that arrives in Chester in 893, the same year that this group leaves Dublin. And I'm suggesting that that may have been an attempt to link up the activities of Vikings in England with the activities of Vikings in Dublin at that time. Now, 893 is the first time that the Wirral is mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and it said that Chester at this time was deserted. The events in 893 do suggest to me that there may have also been some Viking settlement in Western England before 902. We tend to think the year 902, the year that some Vikings were expelled from Dublin and arrived on the Wirral, as being the key date that marks the beginning of Viking settlement in northwest England. But as I've suggested, we may be lured into thinking that because there is a lack of written sources from northwest England, considering there's so much activity on the other side of the Irish Sea. It's hard for me to believe that there wasn't any Viking activity on the other side. It's also been something that's long been considered as a possibility. So Ben Edwards' book on Vikings in the Northwest suggests that we've been over-dependent on one historical date to be the starting date for all the archaeology of the Viking Age that we find on England's northwest coast. And we might be better thinking of Viking settlement taking place over a broad time frame. There is no doubt, however, that 902 is clearly a key date when considering the beginning of Viking settlement in the Wirral. So this is the key narratives that tell us about the expulsion of Vikings from Dublin. So according to a text called The Annals of Four Masters, which is a gathering of different Irish chronicles, which were compiled in the 17th century, but based on earlier materials, it talks in 902 the expulsion of the foreigners from Ireland from the fortress of Dublin by Cearbhail, son of Murrigan, and by the Leinstermen and Maelfinia and the men of Briga about him. Leaving great numbers of their ships behind them, they escaped half dead across the sea. So what seems to have happened in 902 is that there was a coalition of Irish kings based north of Dublin and south of Dublin who clubbed together and drove out the Viking leaders from Dublin. And this may have been an opportunistic response to the squabbling that was taking place between the descendants of Ivar at this time. Now, we know from archaeological evidence that Dublin wasn't completely abandoned. So when it talks about the expulsion of foreigners, it's meaning the expulsion of the important foreigners, and the sort of lower class people who stayed behind in Dublin kept the settlement going. There's radiocarbon dates that suggest that Dublin was still occupied at this time. But obviously this event would have huge political ramifications, the dynasty of Ivar being driven from Dublin and having to seek out new places to settle. Now, the Annals of the Four Masters tells that some of the Vikings were initially besieged on Island's Eye, which is an island in Dublin Bay. We then hear of one contingent going to northern France, another contingent heading north to Scotland, and finally the group that we're going to focus on, oops, didn't realise that would spin, which is a group that arrived on the Wirral. So the Wirral, as you may know, was the edge of the Kingdom of Mercia, a large kingdom which stretched from the River Dee down as far as London. At the time when Vikings arrived, it was under the rule of Ethelred and the Ealdorman and his wife Ethelflaed, who was daughter of King Alfred the Great of Wessex. We hear of the arrival of Viking groups through both Welsh chronicles and through an Irish chronicle, the Fragmentary Annals of Ireland. Now, Welsh chronicles tell us that initially a group of Vikings from Dublin under the leadership of Ingemund arrived at Anglesey, and there they attempted to take land, but Cadel ep Rhodri, who is the King of Gwynedd at this time, successfully pushed them away. So they travelled further along the coast where they arrived at the Wirral. Now, Fragmentary Annals of Ireland is a key source for giving us the details of Viking settlement in this area. It is quite late, it's not totally reliable, but according to the Fragmentary Annals of Ireland, Ingemund came to Ethelflaed and asked for lands to settle peacefully. It said that the Vikings were tired of war and they just wanted to settle down and farm the land. And Ethelflaed, who's credited with being a key decision maker in this, decided that she would grant them lands near Chester, and this is associated with Viking settlement on the Wirral. Now, it may be that Ethelflaed thought that it was better to negotiate with the Vikings rather than face conflict. 902 was quite a critical year because a rebellion was taking place in Wessex at this period, and there was an influx of Vikings attacking the southern boundaries of Mercia. Ethelflaed and her husband Ethelred may have wanted to avoid a battle on two fronts, and so ceded territory to the Vikings on the Wirral, perhaps also with the proviso that they could then help protect the region against other Viking attacks. But we have to consider also why the Vikings chose the Wirral in particular. You know, we could see it as, oh, well, they tried to take land in Wales, they didn't succeed, they just travelled along the coast and the next place they came to was the Wirral. But again, I would suggest there was more strategy and thought behind this settlement. One of the things to consider here is, whilst we tend to see the Wirral as being rather marginal within, British geopolitics nowadays, at the time it was an important area of trade in the Irish Sea. Indeed, it had been since prehistory. And we can see that at sites such as Mells here on the tip of the Wirral coast, where since the late 19th century, due to coastal erosion, a huge number of metal artifacts have been recovered, which show that this was a trading site, a seasonal trading base, really from the Roman era, well, even in the Iron Age, up until the late Middle Ages. We've also got not just finds from Mells, I'll illustrate some of them here, these are from all different periods, but we've also got Byzantine coins found on the Wirral dating to the 6th century from sites such as Morton, Leesau and Seacombe, which suggests that this area was important in post-Roman trading networks, and it had links to the Mediterranean, and there were other artifacts that back that up as well. So perhaps the Vikings saw the potential of Wirral as a place to found a market where they could carry on their trading activities, having been expelled from Dublin. I'm also mindful of a recent book published by Tom Horn, which talks about the strategy of Viking settlements in York and Dublin. And he suggests that this is part of a deliberate plan to establish what he calls a kind of network kingdom of trading bases. So that this twin settlement of York and Dublin was developed for the purposes of trade and the transfer of wealth, and that was the focus of the power of the dynasty of Ivar. And with Dublin gone, it may have been that Vikings moved to the Wirral, but perhaps with the hope that they could eventually set up themselves as a power at Chester. And indeed, the fragmentary annals of Ireland tells this to be the case. It said that the Vikings settled on the Wirral initially peacefully, but they soon noticed the wealth and significance of Chester and decided that they wanted to acquire that too. So we can see this as being part of a bigger strategy using the theories that have been developed by Tom Horn in terms of Viking trading bases. Now, Chester was, of course, a Roman legionary centre, so it was fortified, although the fortifications were perhaps in a state that needed repair in the 890s. But it was also something that gave access to a network of roads that would have still been used in the Middle Ages. So you can see the map on the left there, the Roman road network, and you can see Chester or Diva, as it's marked on there, as being a key point within that road network across England. And that is significant for connections between the Irish Sea and also to York, so the other base of power of the dynasty of Ivar. And so one of the things that Tom Horn talks about, he talks about a Cuerdale corridor, a strategic band of land which Vikings sought to control to secure access to trade routes between York and Dublin. And we could see that Chester would be a very significant place to hold for that very purpose. You've got that perfect link to the Irish Sea there through the River Dee, leading up through the Roman road network to York. And that kind of highlights the significance of the Irish Sea within the broader Viking trading network. So this is just a simple map I've downloaded online. I haven't checked the boundaries and dates on here, but it gives you a flavour of the sheer range of Viking trading networks in this period, through down to the Mediterranean, to the Black Sea, to the Caspian Sea, trading as far afield as the Middle East, up to the Arctic Circle, and west even as far as Newfoundland. And within that broad geographical scope, the Irish Sea has a fairly central location. It was significant within this broader network. And that takes us back to this strategy of contacts between East and West Coast Britain, something which has also been a topic of some significance in Fiona Edmonds' recent book about Northumbria in the Middle Ages, where she talks about the transit routes from Northumbria to England's west coast. And this significance is exemplified by the Cuerdale hoard itself. So Tom Horn calls it the Cuerdale corridor, named after the very famous Cuerdale hoard. This was deposited around 905, so during this period when the dynasty of Ivar were exiled from Dublin, but still maintaining strong links with York. It's the biggest silver hoard from Britain, composed of about 5 kilos of silver. It was found in the mid-9th century on a fording point of the River Ribble. And the components of the Cuerdale hoard are largely comprised of silver, which was accumulated in Ireland in the form of ingots, but also broadband arm rings and jewellery such as penannular brooches. But there's also a lot of freshly minted coins, which can be linked to the Kingdom of York, suggesting that this great treasure was accumulated through an alliance of Vikings from York and Dublin. But it contains many other components as well: picture silver, Arabic dirhams, items from continental Europe and Scandinavia, showing it to be this vast accumulation of wealth through Viking trading networks. And it has been interpreted maybe as a war chest. Maybe this was meant to fund an army perhaps to go over and try and reclaim Dublin. But for one reason or other, presumably something fairly cataclysmic, such a large amount of silver was buried, but never recovered until it was found in the 19th century by accident. Further south, we also have significant silver hoards as well, which highlight perhaps the importance of the River Dee in this area. So, for example, the Huxley hoard, possibly deposited around a similar date to Curedale. It's comprised of these broadband arm rings, which are usually seen as characteristic of Vikings in Ireland, but they've been flattened for transport. We've got a silver ingot and this sort of twisted rod of silver as well. And you can go and see this on display in the Museum of Liverpool. What it shows is that Viking activity in the Chester area as well at around this same time. And we can see from a map of Viking hoards in England where the kind of economic hotspots were. These were the places that were strategically significant for trade in the Viking Age. So here you've got the Curedale hoard on the River Ribble. You can also see the significance of Morecambe Bay, the river valleys of the Kent and Lune here, clearly a bit of an economic powerhouse. And I gather from, in informal discussions with metal detectorists, there are other finds from this area that have been recovered, but haven't yet been recorded and indeed may not be so. It's a very unfortunate aspect of metal detecting that not all finds are declared. You can also see the significance of Carlisle here, the Eden Valley, but also look at this big cluster around here that shows the economic importance of the Wirral in the Viking Age. It shows why Chester would be seen as a prize that the Vikings might want to obtain. And that leads us up to an event recorded in the fragmentary Annals of Ireland, which is the Siege of Chester. This is when the Vikings went beyond the lands that they were assigned in the Wirral and decided to try and capture Chester and bring it under their control. Now, the date of the Siege of Chester has recently been revised by Matt Firth in an article that I think was just published last year. It's quite interesting. He suggests that the Siege of Chester probably took place around the year 910, which is later than it has conventionally been dated. And in order to review this, we need to look at the fairly long and complex accounts of the Siege of Chester in the fragmentary Annals of Ireland. And I've just included a snippet from that account here on this PowerPoint slide. So the fragmentary Annals of Ireland is a complex text. It's a compilation of two texts, one which is characterized by quite short and brief analytic entries, and another text which was quite verbose and saga-like. And the sort of separate chronologies of these two texts have been awkwardly mixed together, so that the dating the fragmentary Annals of Ireland is sort of all over the place, but when you separate out the different strands, it starts to make sense. You can just see somebody's kind of bodged the job of linking them together. And Matt Firth wisely points out that the event, the Siege of Chester, is fitted between recorded annals of the dates 909 and 9010, which could suggest that, yeah, he's right in suggesting this later date for the Siege of Chester. The actual entry, which describes the Siege of Chester, contains three different components. It opens up saying 4 years before, Vikings had been driven from Ireland, which would suggest 906, looking back to 902. And it sort of does almost a flashback narrative to the arrival of the Vikings in the Wirral. Secondly, it says almost at the same time, a battle was fought in North Britain, in Alba. Now, Matt Firth doesn't discuss this, but the editor of the text dated this battle to the year 918, thought it was the Battle of Corbridge. But I would suggest it's actually a battle that took place in Alba in 904, which is well recorded, a conflict between the Vikings and the people of Alba, which the Vikings were defeated. And it's sort of saying that's almost at the same time then that Ingemund arrives. That could suggest Ingemund arrived around 903. So perhaps he was expelled from Dublin, tried to take a landholding on the North Welsh coast, failed, came to the Wirral, maybe late 903, if we're trusting fragmentary Annals of Ireland as a reliable source on this, questionable. But that 904, almost at the same time, there was this battle fought in Alba. It then goes on to say that once Ingemund and his followers had decided to set their sights on Chester, that there were many battles and wars that took place. So there could have been quite a prolonged period of antagonism between the Vikings and the Wirral and the rulers of Mercia before the siege of Chester took place. And it's interesting to note that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that Chester was refortified in the year 907, perhaps with this conflict taking place. The decision is to try and protect Chester by strengthening the walls. Then we get the account of the siege of Chester, and it says that this takes place when Ethelred, the alderman of Mercia, is sick, and so Ethelflaed is having to take over the reins of government. And that could fit well with the suggested date of 909 or 910 for the actual direct attack on Chester. And there are other things happening in 909 and 910 which would also suggest this date is viable. In 909, Edward, who is king of Wessex, who was the brother of Ethelflaed of Mercia, plundered Northumbria, and in the year 910 there was a battle that took place at Tettenhall in Staffordshire between the Vikings of Northumbria and the English kings. So that makes sense that maybe the Battle of Chester took place when Matthew Firth argues. But it also makes the failure of the conquest of Chester a significant blow to the ambitions of Vikings in England, which I think doesn't tend to be recognised enough. If you see it within the broader geopolitics and the events of the period, this would have been a huge gain for the Vikings at 910, at a critical period when Vikings were trying to establish their authority across the north of England. Now, the quote on the slide is quite well known. I think it's an absolutely fantastic description of what a medieval siege could have been like, although it has this rather narrative flavour, the sort of rule of three as a narrative structure. But it describes the Vikings trying to overcome the walls of the settlement. However, the other army, the Norwegians, were under the hurdles, making a hole in the wall. What the Saxons and the Irish, so it recognises that there were Irish allied with the Saxons inside the walls of Chester, was hurled down huge boulders so that they crushed the hurdles on their heads. What the Norwegians did to prevent that was put great columns under the hurdles. What the Saxons did was to put ale and water they found in the town's cauldrons, boil it and throw it over the people who were under the hurdles so that their skin peeled off them. The Norwegians' response was to spread hides on the top of the hurdles. The Saxons then scattered all the beehives that were in the town on top of the besiegers, which prevented them from moving their hands and feet because of the number of bees stinging them. And after that, they gave up the siege. So quite famously, it was the bees that saved Chester. Now, having successfully defended Chester from Vikings, what we can see is almost a defensive ring of boroughs being set up around the Wirral. So Edisbury, founded by Ethelflaed in 914, Runcorn in 915. It suggests a concern to prevent further Viking incursions in this area and along the River Mersey as well. And Ethelflaed is really quite a remarkable character as a woman who ruled in her own right in the Kingdom of Mercia, and indeed briefly passed on power to her daughter after her death before the area was taken under the control of Wessex. And as a result, the Vikings, perhaps having tried and failed to capture Chester, if we can rely on the narrative of the fragmentary annals of Ireland, focused on developing their settlement in the Wirral. And it really has a very strong concentration of Viking place names. It has a very interesting gathering of Viking age sculpture, which suggests that this was something of a Viking enclave. It was its own little settlement. It's quite interesting. We've got names such as Thingwall, which suggests that this was the site of a Viking assembly. So they had their own form of local government. And we've also got the place name Raby, which means boundary settlement, suggesting that there was a recognised edge of where this Viking enclave ended. So perhaps an element of Viking self-government in this area of the Wirral, but also looking across to the fact that there are Viking settlement names north of the Mersey with their own Thingwall, And there's also sculptures and evidence of Viking cultural contact along the North Welsh coast as well. So from that map of places and sites, we can look at the longer term cultural impact of Viking settlers in the Wirral. And we can exemplify this through sites where they have Viking settlement names in archaeology. One example would, of course, be Irby in the Wirral, there being a Norse place name element for a settlement, but the first bit, the being for the era, the settlement of the Irish. So the Vikings who came to Wirral would have been a mixed group of people, perhaps with Scandinavian ancestry, but also Irish as well. Now, excavations at Wirral some years ago undertaken by Rob Philpott revealed 3 bow-sided buildings, and this artefact you see on the right, which is a broken spike lamp. It's got a foot that you would use to press down on something, and it's basically a clay cup that would have held some flammable material, and it would have served as a lamp. And that's dated from the 10th to the 12th century, which helps us identify the settlement of Irby as a Viking Age farmstead. We've also got sites of sculpture in the Wirral as well, which are significant because the constructing of sculpture suggests there was wealth. There was wealth generated in the area through trade, which meant that high status patrons wanted to establish monuments in local churches that would display their significance to the people around them. And the form of these sculptures is also interesting because they're stylistically quite hybrid. The ring-headed crosses, which they bear, show influence across the Irish Sea, but we've got interlaced patterns and design which show other kind of insular influences as well. So this is an illustration from Neston. We've got on the right-hand side, this is the arm of a cross head which is broken off. You've got this rather charming angelic figure here with heavy-duty footwear, but nice little wings. So it's quite similar to some Irish representations I've seen of Irish figures on high crosses. And we've also got figurative scenes. What we've got here is a sort of almost, we've got some of these fragments at Neston, and it was reimagined how they may have been put together originally as a monument. But these figurative scenes are absolutely charming. We've got images of people. We've also got a couple here embracing and a scene of hunting. So there's 5 fragments have been recovered from Wirral, probably of 10th and 11th century date, but there's other Viking Age sculpture also at West Kirby and Bromborough. And I'm sure you will hear more from other speakers talking about the long-term Viking cultural influence on the Wirral. So my last slide is simply a plug actually for a phone app which you can download free of charge, which is called the Viking Age in the Northwest, and it will give you details on many of the Viking sites in Wirral, whether they be place names or sculpture and whatever. So I'd invite you to look at that. So the purpose of the lecture overall has been to highlight the significance of this area, the area of the Wirral, with its links across the Irish Sea, which encouraged the Vikings to come and settle here after 902, but also why they stayed and why they had such a long impact on the area. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, folks, you're allowed to unmute as we applaud. Thanks, Claire. There we are. Excellent. Oh, folks, can you mind muting again?
Great. Are you still there, Steve? Because I can't hear you just now.
Claire, can you hear me?
I can hear you just perfectly now. Thank you, Steve. Yeah.
So just saying thanks ever so much indeed. That was absolutely fantastic, and it went really smoothly. I think we all agreed there were no hitches and things, and every slide came through clearly. And there's some questions people have asked on the chat here. But before we throw it open to those, I thought I'd ask my own question really. And that Ingerman, right? You mentioned the dynasty of Ivar. By the way, let's put my camera on. Claire should plug this as well. This is a great book on the Viking kings of Britain and Ireland, the dynasty of Ivar, as well as a wonderful app. But Ingemund, how did he fit in with this dynasty? Do we know? Is there anything in the extensive chronicles in Ireland which links Ingemund with Ivar, or we just don't know?
No, we don't. So what we've really got is the pieces of the evidence. So we've got the Vikings being expelled from 902, and then we get Welsh chronicles telling us that Igmund, which is the same individual, turns up in Anglesey, and then we've got the fragmentary annals of Ireland, which probably that element of the text is 11th century, or could even be a little later. So that raises a few questions, but that then he arrives in the Wirral. So it's really just that he's associated with that outflow of leaders from Dublin. We don't know that Ingemund was a member of the dynasty of Ivar. His name isn't otherwise recorded within the family. But the political strategy, if that is what it is, that they're looking for an alternative trading base to Dublin, would be very much part of the political strategy of the dynasty of Ivar. And if the siege of Chester took place 909, 910, as Matt Firth is suggesting, and I think is plausible, then that fits also very closely with the political strategy of the dynasty of Ivar at the time. So that if he wasn't a member of that group, his activities suggest he was allied with them.
Yeah, and the other question before I pass it on is that we've finished with the fighting and this prolonged scrap at Chester, which appears, as Matt has shown, to have taken place longer than we thought and later. But at what point? Because at some point they settle the differences, because Chester became this dual financial centre with Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons working side by side. So at what point do you think they settled their differences and started working together? Or we don't know?
We don't know, but I mean, it could be as early as after they failed to take over Chester. Because basically from the 920s until about 980, the majority of English coins that are found in Ireland were minted in Chester, which suggests that Chester was hugely economically significant for trade across the Irish Sea. The dynasty of Ivar had also re-established themselves back in Dublin by 918. And so it would have been in their best interests that trade would overcome those political differences, and it would be better to work together than work apart. So I think they tried and failed. But what you see really from the 910s and until the mid-10th century is this slow, prolonged kind of battle, if you like, for control of the north of England, which ultimately the Vikings lost. And by 919, they'd taken the kings of Wessex had extended their control northwards to Manchester. They were making inroads into Northumbria, and that would have isolated the Wirral land-wise, from other areas of Viking settlement. So I suspect really maybe as early as the second decade of the 10th century, there was some modus vivendi. But it's kind of interesting that the Battle of Brunanburh suggests that battle location, if we believe it was fought near Bromborough, which I think is the argument that both you and I have put forward, Steve, was that that would maybe suggest that the Dubliners sort of came to the area because they thought the local population might be sympathetic. They might get the logistical support from the people in Wirral for this attempt, to overcome King Athelstan.
Yeah, and we believe that. Not everyone does, but we believe that. But also the other interesting thing was the fact that when they came over, they lost Dublin, but we've got another beach market we can use now. Let's build Wirral up as like a substitute for this and make the best of it, which it seems is what they did after they failed to get Chester. They made the best of what they had.
Yeah, they continued the Irish Sea trade. I mean, Dublin still functioned, but we can sort of see the flow of silver from Dublin going into the hands of the Southern Ale kings at this time. There were some very significant silver hoards found in County Westmeath around the sort of second decade of the first and second decade of the 10th century. But yeah, but they would have set themselves up and carried on in business, but at another location until they could regain control of Dublin once again.
Yeah. And it was just the big guys who got kicked out, not everyone. That's another important point that came across. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of shows that our historical sources tend to be very elitist. So they say the foreigners were expelled, but what they mean is the foreigners that count politically. And you know, the people who were the tradesmen and your average people they didn't have the same mobility. And
Didn't
they
get a mention. No. Anyway, we've got a number of points coming up here. Firstly, Eileen Johnson says, hope this is the first of many. Thank you for such an interesting presentation. And Sue's got camera problems and things. We're sorry about that, Sue. But she says, really interesting. Do you know whether the Vikings who came to the Wirral were Christian?
I think some of them weren't and some of them were, which is an easy cop out. But we don't know. So West Kirby is dedicated to St. Bridget, who is, of course, a famous Leinster saint. And we don't know if the cult of Bridget was established before or after the Vikings arrived. But W.G. Collingwood, back as early as 1927, peddled the idea that some of the Vikings who came across the Irish Sea from Dublin brought the cults of Irish saints with them. So some of them may have already been under Christian influence. And we know that some of the Vikings came with people from Ireland as well. So they'd already mixed and integrated. So some conversion could possibly have taken place. We've also got this flourishing of sculpture in areas where Vikings settled by the mid-10th century, which would suggest that if they weren't Christian when they arrived, within a generation or two, there's quite a lot of assimilation to Christian thinking. I've a PhD student who completed last year, Danica, who's written about the furnished Viking Age burials at ecclesiastical sites around the Irish Sea. And so she's been arguing that there was quite a lot of integration between the Vikings and the churches. So what we've tended to see as an antagonistic relationship, she's arguing on archaeological grounds, is actually perhaps something more peaceful. She sees the Vikings trying to integrate basically within ecclesiastical structures where they settled. Yeah,
and Ingerman himself might have had an Irish mum. Yeah,
we don't know. Yeah, quite possible.
We just don't know. Possible. Yeah. Right. So Liz, Colleen says, thanks, Claire. Very interesting indeed, and great to bring a number of different aspects into the same arena. Liz Curtis, excellent. Many thanks. Very clear and informative. Stephen Cameron says, very interesting talk. Have you done any research on Viking Norse activity in and around Larne on the County Antrim coast? It's mentioned, this is mentioned in the early annals and blah, 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 blah. And there's identified the Antrim County Archaeological Society have identified many new sites.
Yeah. I haven't specifically focused on that area, but I'm aware that there is a Viking burial at Larne that was discovered in the mid-19th century when they were building the railway along the coast there, and that some recent work has been done which has pinpointed the exact site of that burial. So it was found in these mid-19th century circumstances, so the bits got split up. I think some of the things went to Northumbria, and some of the items were lost. So I'm aware that there is recent research being done there. And I think also Russell O'Regan has recently done a PhD thesis, which is available online, and I believe he looks a lot at Viking activity along that northeast coast of Ireland. So it's an area where there is increasing amount of work being done, and I think it highlights our awareness. I think in the traditional historiography of Vikings in Ireland, we tended to think of Dublin and Munster, the south coast, as being the focus of Viking activity, but there is quite a good body of chronicle evidence showing Viking activity was taking place around the northeast coast of Ireland as well. So it's great that more archaeological work is being done to shed light on this. So I'm being distracted by a very demanding dog down here. I'm going to have to put him on my lap. I've decided I've been talking far too long.
Right. So we just got two more questions, Claire. You can. One is from Patrick. Great talk, Claire. Do you know much more about Ottar? And isn't it amazing how two kings at the time had such strong wives? Otto and Olaf married to Aud the Deep-Minded, who played such a significant role. So it become a lot.
Yeah, well, this is it. I was actually contacted by somebody who's hypothesizing that Ota and Aud might be the same person, but it's just so difficult because the Coggail Regal of the War of the Irish and the Foreigners, where you've got this great story of Ota issuing her pagan prophecies on the altar. It's such a late text, and we don't know what the links are from that to events that happened in the 9th century. And I say, Turkish, we've also got this great story by Gerald of Wales, I mean, it's a Irish warriors in drag, killing off the Vikings. It you know what I mean? It's the boundaries between fact and fiction get blurred very easily by the time we've got saga writing of the 12th century and later. So it's very difficult for me as a historian who's focused on the 9th century evidence to know how much we can claim to factually know about figures such as Ota when they first appear in our records so late. But it is so interesting. We also get in Cog of this 12th century text, we get reference to Ingun Rua, a figure, a woman leading a Viking fleet. But again, it's not cross-referenced in the 9th century. So is this real, or is it just a good story?
That's right.
Yeah.
But sagas are also about storytelling to make it interesting, not just about historical record. We know that, yeah. Okay, finally, is it Bobby the dog? Is waiting for attention?
Yeah, no, he's gone to the sofa now. I'm off the hook.
Okay, gone for a salt. So Peter Blenkinsop, who's online there, has asked this question, and I'm glad you're here too, Claire, because Peter says, why do you think Brunanburh was located near? Why do you not think Brunanburh was located near Boroughbridge, as opposed to the Wirral, as per Michael Wood's belief?
Right. Well, I would just refer you to an article about this rather than go through the whole argument. But I think geopolitically, the northwest of England makes sense. And Michael Wood's argument is very much premised on John of Worcester stating that the fleet arrived through the River Humber. And I wrote an article which I think was published last year, or was it the year before, in the Transactions of the Lancashire and Cheshire Historical Society. If you can't get it free online, just drop me an email and I'll send it to you, where I kind of went through and showed how all the medieval texts that refer to the Humber just go back to John of Worcester, and they can't be tracked further back to an alleged 10th century source, which is what Michael Woods was arguing. And I also showed that John of Worcester, there's some problems in his records of river names and geography in other places, which suggests that he might not be entirely reliable. He might have just assumed that a great army coming to fight at this time would have come in through the River Humber, seeing as it was such a major routeway into Northumbria. And so, yeah, that rather than go through the whole thing here, I'll just please read the article and then come back to me. I'm quite happy to debate it. But I also think as well, I don't mind the fact that people seem to get very het up about where Brunanburh was fought, and I'm quite happy if we just keep arguing it and discussing it. That's what scholarship's about. I don't think we can ever conclusively prove. It would be very hard to conclusively prove exactly where the battle was fought. But I do think Brunanburh is the best contender.
And John of Worcester may have made an error, but that's not Michael's fault.
No, Michael's a great historian, and a nice man to be. But we can agree to disagree. That's fine. That's
and it's done on probabilities, isn't it? Really, and and because I'm from Wirral, people say, "Oh, you want the battle to take place on Wirral," but that's not true. I mean, it's a Viking defeat. I'm a Viking fan, so if Michael Wood can prove the battle took place in Yorkshire, then great, But as an academic, as a scientist or historian, you've got to follow what's right and what's most probable, and we follow lines of evidence, and people's opinions differ. We have to accept that. And Michael has one view. You and me, Claire, have a different view. So Does that answer your question, Peter?
Most certainly, thank you.
Yeah. So we're not ruling him out, but it's probably on probability basis. It seems to be that it's not proven beyond all doubt yet. That's I don't think it ever will be, to be honest. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's.
I think that's what keeps us hooked, though, in medieval history. We never know all the answers, but we're always still trying to unsolve solve the mystery.
Sue gets very annoyed by all this, but yeah, it's an interesting problem to try and solve. That's why we're all involved. Well, a lot of us are involved with this. Yeah, good. And one final thing, Claire. You mentioned at the start about the settlements in Ireland, especially in the north, and then this the carbon dating gives a different answer. It says that we were here 50 years before. Now, when a historian sees that, does the historian take the scientific value without question, or does the historian question the accuracy of the scientific measurement? Is there this fear of the scientist, or what?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think the problem has tended to be the other way, in that I think, I mean, for example, I'd say dating the whole Viking settlement in northwest England to 902 is where archaeologists have played undue emphasis on one historical piece of evidence, and then they've used that as the starting gun. And I don't think we should do that, particularly when it's, yeah, I feel that it would be quite right to question that and not use it as a basis for assumptions when doing archaeological dating. Now, these burials which Lindsay Simpson examined in Dublin, which preserve this early date, I think, I mean, to me, there is this plausible context of Viking activity in the area in the 790s, which could possibly fit in. So that therefore, it's not that the archaeology and the history can't be reconciled. It just makes us question some of our assumptions. But obviously, when you do get archaeological data and it does challenge existing ideas, then you have to test the data. I mean, sometimes the problem actually historians have with archaeology, and this is a huge generalization, is that, it's science, therefore it's fact, therefore we can't question it. And I think sometimes historians lack the training to question and evaluate the archaeological data. But I think there's enough interdisciplinary specialists working on the Viking Age. It's less of a problem in our area than maybe in others. I mean, I know one thing that David Griffiths has suggested with those early radiocarbon dates is the marine reservoir effect, that because I think the Vikings had quite a maritime lifestyle, their diet, for example, being heavily based on maritime resources more than, say, other people, that apparently that can skew your radiocarbon dating. So that needs to be taken into account. In fact, I can see Shane McLeod has written, were Lindsay's finds marine corrected? I don't think that there has been a definitive answer on that. I still think that they're still thinking that there could be late 8th century rather than mid 9th century, which is what the assumption would have otherwise been. Yeah. So there are factors there to consider. So it just encourages us to ask more questions, to refine and challenge the data. And
that's good. And that's not the only complication with carbon dating. There's other problems as well. But and you're right. I think there's a better dialogue now between the different disciplines, and there's less fear of what the others are doing. That's how it should. That's how it should be. People, working together. So that's good. That's good. Right. I think. Oh, where can I get Russell's paper?
I'll tell you what. I will just put his name in, and I bet you he will have an academia.edu or a ResearchGate page where you'll be able to look up his publications. He did his PhD in Cambridge under James Barrett in archaeology. And that's right. So I know his PhD is available online. So I think it's just a case of doing a search through that name, looking for a Cambridge PhD supervised by James Barrett. or if you Google Russell's name and you do something like medieval or Viking as a search with his name, it'll probably lead you to a site where you can access his publications.
And you'll get that. That's right. If not, come and drop us an email, and we will. Yeah. Okay. With a name like that, you should be able to isolate the paper.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Fantastic. Right. Any more questions for Claire? No, Bobby is happy. No, I think.
Yeah, and apologies, I did talk rather longer than I planned to. So.
No, that's absolutely fine. Actually, we did start a bit late anyway. And thanks everyone for joining. We've had fantastic numbers of people coming along, and I hope you heard the talk okay and everything went all right. There's a lot of thumbs up came up. So yeah, another talk soon. In fact, the next speaker we want to ask is someone who gave a talk at the Viking Society conference last year. That's Jacob from Lancaster, about the churches. That relates to Sue's question about the Viking Age churches on the Wirral. But we'll post dates on the Wirral Viking Trail site, and also Claire, if you give me a list of the talks for the Viking Society, we'll get those listed as well. Sue, do you want to say anything? I know your camera's not working.
No, just really thank you very much for that. That was absolutely brilliant. Yeah, it's really great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the invite, and thanks everybody for logging in to listen as well. Yeah, and yeah, I can see there's a comment there. Yeah, if anybody wants to come and see Vikings in the Wirral, then I'm sure myself or Steve will be happy to tell you about some of the sites to go and see.
Fantastic. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Sue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, folks.
Okay, thank you.